To understand how we created the Alliance for Equal Justice, it's necessary to study the history of civil legal aid of the past 50 years, both at a statewide level and at the national level. The timeline before you shows the interplay between these levels, with the statewide developments on top and the national on the bottom. But before we explore our history, let's first define why civil legal aid was necessary to begin with.
So with this legal aid work, with civil legal aid, with public interest law, the common theme is that we have gross inequalities, gross inequities in our world.
I think what's important is that legal services has offices in these communities where the community can go to have their problems heard and to have people work to address the injustices that they're facing.
So equal justice to me is at least you have a fair fight. I mean, it's coming in here. If you don't have an attorney representing you and the other side does, it's like going into a boxing ring and you got one hand tied behind your back and you're blindfolded. I mean, you're just going to get creamed.
With this shared understanding of the necessity of legal services, let's get started with the history. As a part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty in the 1960s, he appointed Sergeant Shriver as the director of the new Office of Economic Opportunity. Shriver saw that marginalized communities lacked the resources to access justice through the legal system, and so he established the first federal funding for legal service programs across the nation. In 1967, the first federally funded legal service programs were opened in the state of Washington. Greg Dallaire was hired as the director of the Seattle-King County Legal Aid Bureau in 1970 and set out to reimagine the way the program operated.
I started to encourage the staff to act like lawyers for businesses. They do everything for them. They advise them, they go to court with them, they write laws, they do all sorts of stuff that lawyers are trained to do. They don't just sit in the office and wait for the client to come to them. And so that's what we ought to be doing, and think about the clients as a corporation. Maybe think of them as a community, and we represent the client community.
In 1974, one of Republican Richard Nixon's last acts as president before he resigned was to create the Legal Services Corporation. With this, the LSC, as it came to be known, institutionalized federal legal service funding. In Washington state, LSC forced a merger of the legal aid programs, and the new program, Evergreen Legal Services, was started in December of 1976. Greg Dallaire became the program's director.
I felt that it was very important that we have a policy consistent with a mission.
The mission statement, I don't think I've ever seen one that's better. No less than 1/2 of the organization's resources shall go to addressing underlying causes of poverty, and no less than 1/3 of the program's resources shall go to individual representation.
I was pushing people and saying, what are the problems in the community and what are you doing about them?
Greg in particular, he wasn't the only director nationally, but he was very, very intentional about creating and protecting and defending a Native American project, an institutions legal services project, and a farm worker division.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan became President of the United States. During his time as the governor of California, Reagan had developed an antagonistic relationship to legal services. As president, he now sought to cut LSC's federal funding.
When Reagan became president, the president appoints the Legal Services Corporation Board. So the fox was in the hen house.
In the 70s, there was legal services came close to what was called full funding.
For every 5,000 people who fall within our federal guidelines, which is, I believe, 200% of the federal poverty level, there should be one civil legal aid attorney.
They thought they were going to get there, and when Reagan came in, he originally wanted to eliminate legal services because he'd fought with legal services when he was governor of California, and he couldn't accomplish that, but what he did accomplish was big cuts, and so a lot of people got laid off, which has a huge psychological effect, but the biggest effect is always on how many people you can help, how many people you can represent.
In response to the cuts to the LSC budget, legal service programs sought alternative funding sources to alleviate the losses. Private donations had long been, and continue to be, an important supplemental revenue stream, but they couldn't make up the new deficit themselves. And so, in 1984, the Washington Supreme Court created the Legal Foundation of Washington, or LFW, to handle and distribute the funds generated by the new Interest on Lawyers Trust Account, or IOLTA program. Since 1984, LFW has distributed more than $200 million to Washington's legal aid community. But funding cuts weren't the only assault on legal services by the Reagan and later Bush administrations.
We were in a very elite gang of organizations that were being targeted by what we called gotcha interrogation, investigative monitoring teams.
There was definitely a tension there because people who were just trying to do good work and make a difference in their communities were really under attack.
It was really hard. And one of my goals has been not to allow the next generation to have to go through that, and to put supports in place so that they wouldn't ever have to go through that kind of isolation and fear.
Ada Shin-Jaffe, who had become the director of Evergreen Legal Services in 1985, succeeding Greg Delaire, spearheaded a campaign in the early 90s to secure support for legal services from the legal institutions of Washington state. In a meeting with the State Bar Association, she argued,
what's the value of the law if there's no way to implement it? And who then is supposed to take responsibility for it if it isn't the Washington State Bar Association?
Over the course of 4 years, Ada and a bipartisan group of legal aid advocates were able to convince the Bar Association and the state Supreme Court of their obligation to the legal service client community. This effort was successful. In 1994, the Supreme Court created the Access to Justice Board and ordered it to establish, coordinate, and oversee a statewide integrated, non-duplicative civil legal services delivery system that is responsive to the needs of the poor, vulnerable, and moderate means individuals.
The board is a appointed board directly by the state Supreme Court, and we report. I serve on the board. I'm a member of the Access to Justice Board, and we report directly to the state Supreme Court. So we give them recommendations. We also set policy ourselves,
which are designed to cohere a symphony orchestra of different instruments to be playing off of the same sheet of music.
Because of the ATJ board, for example, going to the Supreme Court, I was actually on it at that time and saying if we could quantify civil legal needs, we might be better able to situate ourselves to address them. And that was how the state Supreme Court decided that we should have that very first civil legal needs study.
It's such a big thing to have the bar generally, and not everybody, I don't think everybody in the bar, all lawyers support this, but the institutionalized bar and the courts support the mission of legal services.
all in the furtherance. I mean, everybody has the same goal to try, because we can't meet all the needs. We cannot. We don't have enough resources, but we try to marshal the resources we have. We try to get more resources so that, again, there is an actual justice system, at least as much as we can provide.
In 1995, the United States Congress came under the control of a Republican majority for the first time in 40 years. Led by Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, the new Congress worked to restrict Legal Services Corporation money, posing an existential threat to programs across the country.
Appropriation language. So for the first time, Congress put in appropriation language that said that if you represented, if you got federal money at all, if you received federal money, you would not be able to represent undocumented immigrants. You would not be able to do class actions. You couldn't engage in any kind of legislative advocacy, even if you got other money with which to do that work. In Washington state, the leadership of the legal services movement said, well, we need to be able to offer a full range of services to low-income people in Washington. So to do that, we have to really create a new program that can apply for the federal funds. And so that was going to be Northwest Justice Project, that would accept the federal money and work under the restrictions that were now placed on it. And Columbia Legal Services will do the impact work that low-income people in Washington need someone to do and won't take the federal money.
But offering the full range of services isn't enough if you don't have an efficient way to administer them. And so, the Northwest Justice Project, using the newly restricted LSC money, set up the Coordinated Legal Education, Advice, and Referral, or CLEAR hotline, which acts as a statewide intake and coordination service for civil legal aid in Washington state.
CLEAR is like 911 for legal advice.
A legal hotline
Northwest Justice Project.
to get the services to people that they need.
One of the benefits of CLEAR was that it strengthened the connection between the state's legal aid providers and pro bono network. Pro bono work is the oldest form of legal aid, so let's take a minute to define it and why it remains vital.
So pro bono means that lawyers are giving their service to low-income people at no charge. And the reason why it's so important to our legal aid network here in Washington State is because it allows us to leverage our resources. We have 3,000 attorneys who are donating time and effort and expertise to help people who wouldn't otherwise have access to an attorney. We already know that there is a greater need than what we can meet, and we're doing everything we can to adapt to that. But when a client comes into my office with a housing law issue, a family law issue, needing help with filing bankruptcy, complaints about discrimination in their housing, we're able to help them because our programs enlist the help of all those volunteers. We don't just have housing attorneys, we have civil rights attorneys that volunteer for us. We don't just have bankruptcy attorneys, we have foreclosure specialists who are able to look at something and evaluate, yes, that's an illegal foreclosure, or that's unlawful. So when we talk about a full range of services, we're not just talking about getting help with one isolated issue. We're talking about wraparound services that can really help people tackle the sum of their legal problems, not just one of them.
And so, through resilience and adaptability in the face of crisis, the end of the 20th century saw the legal aid community in the state of Washington connected like never before. By this time, the range of providers had grown and included a number of programs that dealt with specialized issues, like Team Child and the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. This constellation of programs was already collaboratively organized through efforts like the Access to Justice Board's statewide planning efforts and conferences, the CLEAR hotline, collective funding initiatives directed by LFW, and the shared struggles of the 80s and 90s. But in 2004, in an effort by the ATJ Board's communication team to develop a coherent and collective voice for legal service providers in the state, the Alliance for Equal Justice was created.
So the Alliance is all of these organizations that are providing some level of service to low-income people, whether it's full representation, whether it's referral, whatever it is people who are committed to supporting this work. And the value of collaboration cannot be underestimated.
And I've seen the difference. I worked in another state for a period of time where there was not the collaboration. There was more between programs. There was more competition for funds rather than that joint planning and collaboration. And it meant that there were more gaps in the delivery system because there was not that willingness to work together.
The other thing about the Alliance and the ATJ Board that's such a big thing is what are called the hallmarks or the values that people subscribe to. And really, the values have allowed the system to continue to do things, including class actions and some legislative work and representing undocumented people and prisoners. All of those kinds of work are important. The individual representation is important. The work that people can do with LSC funding is important. But the real importance is the array of things. And this network, the ATJ Board and the network and the Alliance, has allowed those values to permeate everything. And it really is an incredible strength of the whole system. 2017 marks 50 years since the first Office of Economic Opportunity legal service programs were opened in the state of Washington. Looking forward, the entire Alliance can take heart in the lessons provided by the past.
I have so much confidence in the resiliency and the commitment of the legal aid community in Washington State. Actually, we have a number of people, both who have many years of experience in the system, and we are doing our best to raise up new leaders that will continue to move this work forward. We have our Leadership Academy, which is committed to breaking down silos, working with people across artificial barriers in many different organizations, not just legal organizations, but social service and within client communities to raise up the leaders, to make sure that everyone has a common foundation of training, a common vocabulary that continues to move us forward as we address whatever challenges present in our state.
Indeed, the future is bright.
We are the Alliance.
We are the Alliance.